Contractor's truck was already pulling away when I got the call that the final inspection had passed. I sat in my car in the driveway of what used to be my grandmother's house and just held the phone against my chest for a second. 14 months. That's how long it had been since she passed and left the place to me in her will, and every single one of those months had gone into gutting and rebuilding that little house on Clover Street until it was something she would have been proud of. The inspector had signed off on the electrical, the plumbing, the new roof. It was done. It was mine. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, engine off, listening to the neighborhood. My name is Cassidy Pruitt. I'm 31 years old, and I'm an occupational therapist at a rehab center in Dayton, Ohio. I'm not rich. I'm not flashy. I drive a 2017 Honda that I bought used. I pack my lunch 4 days out of 5, and until 14 months ago, I rented a studio apartment 20 minutes from work. Nobody would look at my life and call it extraordinary. But I had one thing most people my age didn't. I had been saving with intention since I was 23. The same year, my grandmother sat me down at her kitchen table and told me that the only thing a woman truly owns is the ground under her feet. She said it with her coffee going cold beside her and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she meant every word. Her name was Edna Mae Pruitt, and she had lived in that house on Clover Street for 46 years. She paid it off in her 50s, raised 2 kids inside those walls, and kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that fed half the neighbors every summer. When she died at 82, she left the house to me, her only granddaughter, because, and I will never forget this from the will, she said I was the one who showed up. Not my uncle. Not his wife. Not their kids. Me. I was the one who drove down every other weekend to help her with groceries. I was the one who took her to her cardiology appointments and sat in the waiting room with a crossword puzzle and a bad cup of hospital coffee. I was the one who fixed the leak under her bathroom sink when she called me at 10 on a Tuesday night because she didn't want to bother a plumber. She left me the house, and she was right to. My uncle, whose name is Garrett, did not see it that way. He found out about the will 3 days after the funeral. I remember the exact moment he read it because his face went through about 6 different expressions in 4 seconds: confusion, then disbelief, then something I can only describe as calculation. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just folded the paper back along its crease and said, "Well, we'll have to figure out what to do about that." I didn't know what that meant yet. I would find out. Garrett is 56 years old. He works in insurance, owns a house in a suburb of Cincinnati, and has spent most of his adult life treating our grandmother like a quarterly obligation, a birthday card, a Christmas visit, maybe a phone call if his schedule allowed. His wife, Trish, is the kind of person who gives opinions on everything and takes responsibility for nothing. They have 2 adult sons, both in their late 20s, both living at home, neither one in any rush to change that. At the funeral, Trish pulled me into a hug that lasted about 1 second too long and said, "Edna would have wanted us all to stay close. Family first, right?" I smiled. I should have paid more attention to what she meant by that. The house needed work when I inherited it. Not collapse of the walls work, but 14 months and every spare dollar work. The roof had a slow leak that had been patching with prayers for 3 years. The kitchen was original 1970s cabinetry. The bathrooms needed full gut jobs. The electrical panel was so old the inspector said it during the estate process with a look on his face like he was afraid to touch it. I put together a budget. I pulled out my savings. $11,000 I had been building since I paid off my student loans, and I got a small home improvement loan for the rest. I hired contractors for the structural stuff and did the cosmetic work myself on weekends. Painting, tiling the backsplash, sanding and refinishing the hardwood floors that were under the carpet the whole time. I told almost no one I was doing this. That was a choice, a deliberate one. The reason was Garrett. At the reading of the will, he had made a comment about the property value on Clover Street and how the family might want to discuss what to do with the estate. The estate, as if my grandmother's home was a line item on a balance sheet and not the place where I learned to bake and read and sit quietly with someone I loved. I knew what he wanted. He wanted to sell it and split the proceeds. He called it practical. He called it what makes sense. He did not call it what it was, which was that he thought his 20 years of doing the bare minimum entitled him to half of something a woman's will had given entirely to me. So I kept quiet. I didn't post updates on social media. I didn't bring it up at Thanksgiving when the whole family gathered at my aunt's place and Garrett spent 40 minutes talking about the Cincinnati real estate market. I smiled, I passed the green beans, and I said nothing about Clover Street. The renovations took 14 months because I was doing most of it around my full-time job. Saturdays, I was at the house by 8 in the morning. Sundays, I usually made it by 10. I ate lunch sitting on the floor of whatever room I was working in, usually a sandwich and a bag of chips, and I drove home in the evening smelling like paint and sawdust. My best friend, whose name is Opal, was the only one who really knew what I was doing. She came out 3 Saturdays to help me paint the bedrooms, and she brought snacks each time and never once complained. She told me I was crazy in the best way, and I told her she was probably right. There were hard days when a contractor came back with a number that was $2,000 higher than the original quote. Days when I pulled up carpet to find water damage underneath that added another 3 weeks to the timeline. Days when I drove home exhausted and sat in my apartment and wondered what I was doing, whether I was kidding myself, whether the whole thing was going to fall apart. But I thought about my grandmother, about her sitting at that kitchen table telling me the only thing a woman truly owns is the ground under her feet. I kept going. The day the inspector signed off, I drove to a florist on the way back to the house and bought a single sunflower, her favorite. And I put it in a mason jar on the kitchen windowsill. Then I sat on the back porch where her garden used to be and I let myself feel it. Finished. Mine. Proof that the savings and the sacrifice and the silence had been worth something. I should have known peace was going to have conditions. The photo was Opal's fault. Well, not fault exactly. She came by that weekend to see the finished house and she was so genuinely thrilled about it that she took a dozen pictures and put them on her Instagram with a caption about her best friend being the most hardworking person she knew. She tagged me. She meant it as a compliment. She didn't know about Garrett. I saw the post go live and felt my stomach drop. I asked her to take it down, and she did, within the hour, but by then it had been up long enough. I checked the account that had liked the photo before it disappeared. His wife, Trish. She follows Opal on Instagram. I had forgotten that. I don't know why I had forgotten that, but I had, and it cost me. 2 days later, Garrett called. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't ask how the renovation had gone or how much work I had put in. His opening sentence was, "I heard you've been fixing up your grandmother's house." He said your grandmother's house the way some people say that's an interesting choice when they mean you're making a mistake. "I've been working on it," I said. "It's almost ready." "Ready for what?" he asked. "Are you planning to sell?" "No," I said. "I'm going to live there." Silence. Then, "Cassidy, that's a 3-bedroom house. You're single. You don't have kids." And there it was. The same logic he'd been building since the will was read, finally said out loud. I was one person. The house had 3 bedrooms. His sons existed. The math was obvious to him, if not to anyone with any concept of personal property. "My grandmother left it to me?" I said. "She left it to the family," he said. "She would have wanted everyone taken care of. She wrote a legal will with a lawyer present," I said. "My name is on it, singular." He let that sit for a moment, and then his voice shifted into something smoother, more patient, the way it gets when he's decided he's going to negotiate. "Look, all I'm saying is that it might make sense for the boys to have a place to stay while they get on their feet. Rent-free for a year, maybe 2, give them a chance to save up. It's not like you'd even notice an extra room or two. An extra room or two, like I had bought a storage unit. I would notice," I said, "because it's my house." He made a sound, not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh, and said he thought I was being short-sighted and that we should all get together soon to talk things over. I said sure, we could do that. I had no intention of doing that. I changed the locks the following Monday, new deadbolts on every exterior door, a reinforced strike plate on the front, and a keypad entry on the back door. I'd been planning to do it anyway. The original locks were old, and I had no idea how many keys were floating around from the previous 46 years. But Garrett's phone call moved the timeline up considerably. I did not tell him I had changed the locks. I didn't tell him anything. What I should have anticipated was that his sons had apparently grown up watching their father operate, Because within 2 weeks, the older one, whose name is Kip, started showing up. Not calling first. Showing up. He drove 45 minutes from Cincinnati to knock on the door of a house I had worked 14 months to finish and stand on the porch like he was there for a scheduled visit. The first time, I answered. He said he was just in the neighborhood, which was almost funny given that nobody is just passing through a residential street in Dayton on a Tuesday evening. I talked him through the storm door for about 3 minutes, told him this wasn't a good time, and watched him leave. The second time, I didn't answer. I watched through the window as he walked around to the back of the house, cupped his hands against the kitchen window, and looked inside. Then he stood in the backyard for a few minutes, looking at the dimensions of the space, the same way his father had looked at the value column in a spreadsheet at the will reading. I texted my uncle that same night. I was very clear. I said that Kip was showing up unannounced and that I needed it to stop, that this was my home and I hadn't invited him, and that I expected both of them to respect that. Garrett responded the next morning. He said Kip was family and that family doesn't need an invitation, and that I was being paranoid. He used that word. Paranoid. I didn't respond. I called the security company instead and scheduled an installation for the end of the week. 3 cameras went up, one on the front porch, one on the back, one at the side gate. Motion activated, live feed to my phone. 2 weeks of cloud storage. The tech who installed them was very thorough, and when he finished, he handed me the app login and said, "You'll have eyes on everything." I thanked him, and I meant it more than he probably understood. I kept working my regular schedule. I was splitting my time between my apartment and the house, planning to move in fully at the end of the month. I told my landlord I started packing boxes. Garrett called again 2 weeks later, this time to tell me that he and Trish were thinking about driving up the following Saturday to see the progress. He said it like it was a polite thing, like he was asking. He was not asking. That doesn't work for me, I said. We're a family, Cassidy. I know, I said, and I'll let you know when I'm ready for visitors. I'm not there yet. He hung up before I could say anything else. I moved into the house on a Thursday. Opal and 2 of our other friends helped me bring boxes over, and we ordered pizza on the floor of the living room that night, surrounded by furniture I had picked out myself, in a space I had rebuilt almost from the ground up. It was exactly the kind of evening my grandmother would have loved. Loud and warm and full of food. I thought that chapter was closing. I was wrong. I had been in the house for 11 days when I got a notification at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. I was at work, mid-session with a patient, and I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I finished the session, stepped into the hallway, and checked the app. Motion detected. Backdoor camera. I opened the feed. Kip and his younger brother, whose name I only knew as Cord, a nickname that had stuck since childhood. They were standing at the back door. Kip was doing something with the handle, not just trying it, doing something with it, leaning in close, blocking the camera angle. Then the feed showed movement inside. The back door had opened. I stood in the hallway of the rehab center and felt the air go out of my chest. I watched them go inside. My house, the house I had spent 14 months and every dollar I had rebuilding, the house my grandmother left to me in a legally documented will with a lawyer present. They walked in like they owned it, and I stood in a hospital hallway 11 miles away, watching it happen on a screen the size of my palm. My hands were not shaking when I dialed. I want to be clear about that. I was not shaking. I called 911. I told the dispatcher that I had a live camera feed showing 2 individuals who had entered my property without my permission, that I was not on site, that I could identify both individuals, and that the entry appeared to have been forced. The dispatcher asked for my address, asked me to stay on the line, and told me officers were on their way. I switched back to the app. Cord had opened the refrigerator. Kip was walking from room to room. The same slow assessment his father had done with his eyes at the will, reading 2 years ago. They were talking to each other. I couldn't hear through the camera. But Cord gestured at the living room with what looked like approval, and Kip nodded. I watched 2 officers walk up the front steps 12 minutes later. The knock on the door boomed through the audio feed. I saw Kip freeze in the hallway. I saw Cord set something down on the kitchen counter. Then Kip went to the front door and opened it. The conversation that followed was short. One officer stepped inside. The other stayed on the porch. I watched Kip's body language go from confident to defensive to small, all in about 90 seconds. Both of them were asked to step outside. Both of them complied. The officer who had gone inside came back out, said something into his radio, and the next thing I saw on the feed was my back door being examined. I left work early. My supervisor didn't ask questions. One look at my face and she told me to go. When I pulled up to Clover Street, one of the officers met me at the curb. He walked me through what had happened. The back door lock had not been broken. It had been bypassed. The frame showed marks consistent with a shim or similar tool inserted between the door and the jamb to push the latch back. Not sophisticated. Fast. "Do you know these individuals?" the officer asked. "They're my cousins," I said. "My uncle's sons." He wrote that down without comment. Kip and Cord were still on the sidewalk. Kip's arms were crossed. Cord was looking at his shoes. When I walked toward them, Kip looked up and his first instinct, I watched it happen, was to try to look reasonable. "Cass," he said, "this is ridiculous. We just wanted to look at the place." "You broke in," I said. "The back door was. You used a tool to open a locked door on property you have no legal claim to," I said. "While I was at work, without my knowledge or permission. That's breaking and entering." Cord looked up then for the first time. He looked less defiant than his brother. He looked like someone who had just fully understood the situation he was in. "Our dad said." "I don't care what your dad said," I told him. Not cruelly, just clearly. "Your dad's name is not on this deed. Your name is not on this deed. You don't live here. You were never invited here. What your dad told you doesn't change any of that." An officer came over and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Garrett arrived 40 minutes later. He had driven straight from Cincinnati, which told me Kip had called him immediately. He got out of the car already talking, voice raised, hands moving. "Cassidy, this has gone too far, stop," I said. He stopped. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the two officers standing nearby. Either way, he stopped. "You are not coming in my house," I said. "You are not speaking to me about what is fair or what your mother would have wanted. You made a decision to send your sons here and they are currently being processed for criminal trespassing. That is a consequence of choices you made. You don't get to come here and make this about family." "She was my mother. And she left the house to me," I said. "In a legal document, witnessed and notarized. I have respected her wishes every single day for the past 14 months. I would appreciate it if you started doing the same." He opened his mouth, closed it. Trish, who had come with him and was standing by the car with her arms folded, said something under her breath that I didn't catch and didn't want to. I went inside and shut the door. That night I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the one I had kept, the old oak one that had been in that kitchen since before my mother was born, and I held a cup of tea that went cold while I stared at the wall. The house smelled like fresh paint and old wood, the same smell it had always had underneath everything else, and for a little while I just let myself sit there and feel the weight of the day settle. I cried, I'll say that, not because I was sorry for what I had done, but because Garrett was right about one thing. She was his mother. And somewhere in the distance between who he had been and who he chose to be, that had stopped meaning anything. That was the grief of it. Not the house. Not the break-in. The grief was that we were family and we had ended up here anyway. After a while I washed my cup, dried it, and put it away. Then I called a locksmith. He came first thing the next morning and replaced the back door latch with a heavy-duty deadbolt, added a security bar for backup, and suggested a keypad for the interior garage access as well. I said yes to everything. When he was done, he tested each lock twice and handed me the keypad codes on a slip of paper, which I memorized and then shredded. I called the security company next and had them add a fourth camera at the back gate and upgrade the alert system to include a siren activation if any exterior door was opened without the keypad being entered first. The technician raised an eyebrow when I described what had happened. "That'll keep them out," he said. "That's the idea," I said. I moved fully out of my apartment that weekend. Everything fit in my car and Opal's SUV in 2 trips. I made my bed in the room that had been my grandmother's sewing room, the one with the window that looked out over the neighbor's oak tree. And the first night I slept in it, I woke up twice. Old habit, same as always, but the house was quiet both times. The cameras were on. The locks were locked. The siren was armed. I went back to sleep. The charges moved slowly, the way legal things do. The DA's office called me twice over the following 6 weeks to verify details. Both times I sent them the camera footage. Both times they thanked me and told me the case was building. Kip hired a lawyer. Cord, from what I understood, did not. Garrett stopped calling me directly and started sending texts, alternating between guilt and accusation in a rhythm that was almost impressive. First, you don't know how hard things have been. Second, you've always acted like you were better than this family. Third, Mom would be heartbroken. I read them all. I did not respond to any of them. My mom called. She is Garrett's sister, which makes her my grandmother's daughter, which makes this complicated in ways I don't need to explain. She called on a Sunday evening, gentle as she always is, and said she wasn't taking sides, which meant she was. He's family, Cassidy. I know, Mom. The boys made a mistake. People make mistakes. They broke into my house, I said. They bypassed the lock with a tool they brought with them. That's not a mistake, that's a plan. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I just wish you hadn't called the police. Mom, I said, if strangers had done this, there's no conversation we'd be having. You tell me I absolutely did the right thing. Another quiet, longer. It's different, she said finally. Their family. Their family is supposed to mean more, I said. Not less. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think she agreed with me exactly, but I also think the sentence landed somewhere she had to sit with for a while. We didn't talk for 3 weeks after that call. When we did, she didn't bring up Garrett. I didn't either. Some silences are just where things have to go for a little while. The extended family had opinions. They always do. My aunt on my father's side texted me a paragraph about forgiveness. One of my cousins posted something on Facebook about toxic people destroying families over possessions that I'm fairly certain was directed at me, though my name wasn't there. A woman from my grandmother's church called my mother to say she was praying for the situation. The neighbors were different. The woman next door, whose name is Petra and who has lived on Clover Street for 30 years, knocked on my door with a plate of cookies the week after the police were called. She said, I don't know all of it, but I saw enough, and I want you to know this neighborhood is glad you're here. The man across the street waved at me every morning when I left for work. The kind of deliberate wave that means something without making a production of it. Those things mattered more than I expected them to. I kept going to work. I kept packing lunches. I bought a hose and watered the patch of backyard where my grandmother's garden used to be. Thinking about what I might plant in the spring, I sat on the back porch some evenings with a book I wasn't really reading, just being in the space. Just breathing in the fact that it existed and that I was allowed to be in it. Garrett texted once more about 2 months after the break-in to tell me that the charges had been reduced through plea negotiations and that I should know I had damaged his family in a way that couldn't be undone. He said this as if it was an argument, as if damage were something that started at my front door. I wrote back one sentence. I said, the damage started long before I filed a report. He didn't respond. The legal process eventually settled. Kip accepted a plea that included restitution for the damage to the doorframe and the cost of the upgraded locks, and a period of probation. Cord accepted a similar arrangement. Neither of them would have a charge that followed them in the way a conviction might have, which I had mixed feelings about, but that's how these things usually resolve when there's no prior record and no violence. I still have the camera footage. I still have every text, every voicemail, every email. I keep them in a folder organized by date, not because I expect to need them, but because proof has value. My grandmother taught me that land is something you hold and defend. I would add that documentation is the same kind of thing. The house settled into itself the way old houses do. Creaks and settling sounds at night that I stopped startling at after the first couple of weeks. The oak tree outside my bedroom window went through the rest of fall and dropped its leaves in a way that was slow and not dramatic, which felt right. I refinished the back porch railing by myself on a Saturday in November, sanding it down and restaining it the same warm chestnut color as the floors inside. When I was done, I stood there with the brush in my hand and looked at the yard and thought about what to plant. Tomatoes. Definitely. My grandmother always said Clover Street soil was the best in the neighborhood. Maybe sunflowers along the fence line. Something that would come back every year. The thing people don't tell you about defending something is that after the adrenaline clears, after the legal filings and the family calls and the uncomfortable conversations have all faded into the middle distance, what you're left with is just life, just the regular, quiet business of existing in a space you've chosen. Lunch on the back porch, coffee in the morning by the kitchen window where the sunflower jar still sits, evenings that belong to nobody but you. I had spent most of my adult life being careful not to want too much, keeping the apartment small, the budget tight, the dreams modest. Part of that was practical. Part of it was something I had absorbed from years of being around people who responded to other people's wanting with suspicion, with inventory, with an assessment of what they could claim for themselves. My grandmother did not do that. She saw me wanting something and she handed me a house key. I think about that. I think about what it means to be seen by someone who expected nothing back, only that you would do something worthwhile with what they gave you. That's what the 14 months were. That's what the locked doors and the cameras and the signed charges were, not cruelty, not pettiness. Just a woman taking seriously what someone who loved her had trusted her with. Garrett called on Christmas Eve. I don't know why that day specifically. Maybe he thought the holiday would soften me, or maybe he just finally ran out of strategy and picked up the phone. His voice was tired. He said he hoped I was well. He said the boys were doing okay. He said he missed his mother. I believe that last part. It might be the only thing he's said in 2 years that I believe completely. I said I was glad to hear everyone was okay. I said I thought about her too. I said I hoped he had a good holiday. We hung up without resolving anything because there was nothing left to resolve. The house was mine. It had always been mine. The will said so, the law said so, and 14 months of my own labor had made it so in every way that mattered. What Garrett wanted was something that was never available to him, and no conversation was going to change that. The first of the year, I drove to the garden center and bought packets of seeds, tomatoes and sunflowers like I had planned. Basil, because my grandmother put it in everything. Marigolds for the border, because she always said they kept the rabbits out. I came home, unlocked my front door, the click of the new deadbolt solid and clean, and carried the seeds inside. I set them on the kitchen counter next to the mason jar, standing there in the quiet of her kitchen, in the house she left me and I rebuilt, and I kept. I felt the particular weight of something that has been defended and held. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for anyone's acknowledgement. It just sits there, steady and real, like ground under your feet. I put the kettle on. I had seeds to plan and a spring to get ready for, and nobody in the world had a vote in any of it. People ask me sometimes if I regret pressing charges. Family, they say. You can't undo that. And I understand why they ask. I do, because from the outside, calling the police on your own cousins sounds like the kind of thing that leaves a mark on a person, like you must have lost something in the process, some softness, some willingness to extend grace. But here's what I actually lost. Nothing I hadn't already been losing for years without noticing. What Garrett built, that whole structure of expectation he raised his sons inside, didn't appear the day Kip shimmed open my back door. It had been there for decades, quiet and patient, waiting for something worth taking. My grandmother saw it. I think that's part of why she wrote the will the way she did. She wasn't being cruel to her son. She was being honest about what she had observed across 40 years of watching who showed up and who sent a card. The thing about cause and effect is that it doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. Every Sunday, Garrett skipped. Every appointment someone else drove her to. Every time I sanded a floor or drove 40 minutes to sit in a waiting room with bad coffee. None of it felt like a grand moral statement in the moment. It was just what I did because she was my grandmother and she needed someone. But choices compound. They always do. And eventually the account comes due, one way or another. I think about Kip standing in my hallway, arms crossed, trying to look reasonable while 2 officers waited on the porch. He genuinely believed he had a right to be there. That's the part that stayed with me longest. Not the anger of it, but the certainty. He had been told his whole life that family entitles you. That need is a kind of claim. That wanting something badly enough makes it partly yours. Nobody handed him that belief out of malice. It was just the water he grew up swimming in, but belief doesn't make it true. And a legal document, 14 months of labor, and a deadbolt that cost me $240 says so pretty clearly. I am not a hard person. I want to be clear about that. I cried the night after the charges were filed. I thought about my grandmother and whether she would have wanted this. And I keep coming back to the same answer. She would have wanted me to be honest. She would have wanted me to hold the line. Because a woman who spent 46 years in the same house, who paid it off herself, who kept her garden going and her door open to the right people, that woman understood something about what it means to protect what you've built. She didn't leave me the house so I could hand it over to avoid a difficult conversation. The intelligence in this story, if there is any, is not in the cameras or the legal filings or the upgraded deadbolts, though all of those mattered. It's in learning the difference between guilt and responsibility. Garrett tried to make his choices my problem. For a while, I let myself wonder if he was right. That's the trap. Not the break-in, but the moment after. When someone who violated your space turns around and calls you the one who did damage. I didn't do damage. I drew a line. And I drew it with the same hands that refinished those floors and carried those boxes and bought that single sunflower for the kitchen windowsill. My grandmother said the only thing a woman truly owns is the ground under her feet. I think she meant more than property. I think she meant the space you build inside yourself, the part that knows what you've earned and refuses to apologize for keeping it. That's what I held on to. That's what I'm still holding.